In this section, the main thing will be for you to understand process and procedures for successful working with stakeholders. And that actually means that by the time you're done with this, okay, you will be in a position to analyze the purpose of organizational procedures and process in sourcing goods and or service, compare team management techniques to ensure positive stakeholder relationships, compare the practical considerations of stakeholder management, as well as identify the process for terminating stakeholder relationships. And when we talk about stakeholders, okay, so stakeholders in this case are people who have an active interest or concern about what is being procured. And of course, the interest of such persons will vary, okay? Stakeholders may be interested in the specification, the tender process itself, the evaluation, the award, and the subsequent contract management. And in terms of finance, they might be interested in the outcome of the procurement activity, like financial saving, adding value, innovation, or reduction of waste. And just a quick reminder of who stakeholders can be, okay? So in this case, stakeholders could be people like internal stakeholders, in this case, employee, legal team, contract managers, connected, for example, suppliers, customers, and then you have external stakeholders, such as competition, government agencies, etc. So the key thing here is to really know who they are and also to know how you're going to handle them. And so let's start with analyzing the purpose of organizational procedure and process in sourcing goods and services. Now, of course, each organization has its own rules, has its own procedures when it comes to sourcing for, like goods and services. But then there are things which just cut across most of the organizations. So in this case, we're talking about things like securing value for money from suppliers. Most of your budget in procurement, okay, will be spent on external suppliers. And that means you're really going to have to justify why you spent whatever it is that you spent, and also, the value that you got after you spent that particular amount. Traditionally, procurement has been tasked with achieving the lowest possible price for inputs. But the thing you have to remember here is that just because you procured something at a low price doesn't necessarily mean that that is a good thing. Because look, you could buy something cheap, okay? And so from a financial angle, you look like if you've saved. But then that thing has a cost associated with, say, maintaining it, replacement costs. So cheap isn't always the good idea, and as much as that is what we push for sometimes in procurement. Value for money comes down to the following. Number one, economy. That is minimizing cost for the business in terms of resources used or required inputs. Basically, you're spending less. That's the idea here. Number two, efficiency. That is the relationship between the output from the product or service and the resources to produce it, which would mean you have to spend well, okay? So spending well kind of gives you efficiency. And then the third one is effectiveness. That is the extent to which objectives are met, and that means spending wisely. And finally, we have equity. That is the extent to which services are available and reach all the people they are intended to, meaning you're spending fairly. So 4 things. What are these? We have economy, efficiency, effectiveness, and equity. So those are things that are supposed to help you understand value for money. Now, when you are trying to figure out value for money, okay, when you're trying to define or when you're trying to come up with how you're going to do that, there are a number of questions that you need to ask yourself that will guide you through the process. And these will include, does the product or service actually do what it's required to do? Does the product or service meet the quality levels that are needed? What is the total cost of purchasing the product or service? Is the product or service a high-risk procurement? Now, you also have to remember that value for money will not mean the same thing in public sector, okay? So whatever value for money means in private sector may not really be the same in, public sector. Value for money in private sector relates to shareholder profit and business benefit. But in public sector, it relates to ensuring that taxpayers' money is spent wisely. So that's the thing. And that is the reason why there is a lot of transparency when it comes to procurement in public sector, as opposed to private sector, where you can decide to go with a certain supplier and nobody really asks you a thing. It's your company anyway. So let's move on to the next thing. In this case, let's talk about procurement procedure and processes. So as I've already pointed out, most organizations will have their own procurement procedure and process. And so this could be something like this. The use of competition. This way you obtain price from more than one supplier. So that is a procedure that some organization could use. So an example here could be like, a policy saying that for every, depending on how much you're spending, right? You need to get at least 3 quotes. So for example, under $5,000, you get 1 quote. Between $5,000 to $10,000, you must at least approach 2 suppliers for quotes. $10,000 and above, you use competitive tendering for all contracts, okay? And must have at least 3 suppliers for quotes or tenders. So the thing is, that's just how it works, okay? You have your own procedures. So, they could say for the amount between these to these are the number of suppliers you should actually have approached, get quotes from them. That way, the procedure can be competitive. So the point is that these will actually vary. It will depend on the organization you're dealing with. So, and if it is used creating that policy, of course, these are factors that you'll have to have in mind when you're dealing with suppliers, because the idea here is you're trying to get value, okay? Also, you're trying to make it such that the suppliers are competitive. It isn't just one of those situations where you went with the first person you met. So let's talk about the next thing, the procurement and supply cycle. So procurement provides an opportunity for you to identify areas where you can add value. And the cyclic nature, okay, of procurement will involve things like requirement determination, sources determination, vendor selection, order processing, order monitoring, good receipt, invoice verification, and then you have payment. Again, these are very simplified way of trying to look at the procurement cycle. I mean, if you look at that, there are things you haven't mentioned, which you'll still do, like tendering, okay, award, things of the post, contract management, things of those nature, or post-award management. So, but the idea here is procurement is cyclic. And so let's go through these, okay, and see how you can add value or areas that value addition can, come up. And the first one, let's start with understanding the need. And that's obvious. If you are going to do any procurement, you start by understanding the business needs. And these are the things that you're going to reflect through your specifications, because this is what you want the supplier to take care of, okay, to deliver according to those specifications. And that will also help you to develop your key performance indicators, because if I specify something, if I say that I want you to provide, say, like a calculator or something, then there is a question of what is it supposed to look like, okay? Or how is it, the functioning and all that stuff. And then those are specifications, which can be, you can have performance specification, you can have conformance, all right? So based on those specifications, I'm going to have key performance indicators. So these are the things I'm going to use to assess whether you've met the specification or not. And all that is just part of need understanding, or requirement understanding. Procurement can add value here in a number of ways. Number one, consider the make or buy decision. So at this point, at the point of need, you can decide, should we go with external supplier or should we just do this thing in-house? And that will depend on the advantages that both choices will offer us. Number two, support the formation of cross-departmental team to develop their specification. And why is that important? If you are dealing with other people, it means you have involved all the stakeholders, relevant stakeholders, in the need identification. And so it isn't like if you just came up with this thing. Okay, so they want to just say, yeah, that was your idea, so you do it. Number three, ensure the requirements are not over-specified, because the first thing, one of the things that you'll notice, okay, when you're procuring stuff is that every department will always at some point exaggerate what they need. Either because they think, if we order for more, then we won't have to write requisition in future and blah, blah, blah. So they could over-specify, okay? And that is just in terms of quantity. They can also over-specify in terms of quality. Sometimes they want something that is the best and expensive, yet you could use something generic to solve that problem. Next, review where branded products could be replaced by substitute non-branded product or material to reduce cost. Encourage standardization of common product and services across a company to benefit from leverage possibilities. provide advice on whether a conformance or performance specification could be the most suitable. Okay, and conformance, performance, the idea is that if you tell a supplier, this is what I want you to do. Okay, like you give them the specifications, like I want it to be this size, this color, it should, whatever, like engineering design. So they're supposed to conform with those designs. That is conformance. Those specifications are conformance. But then if you just say, this is what I want. So you do whatever you have to do and get me this. Like I want a website that will do ABCD. Then in terms of how cool and whatever, you come up with something nice. That's performance. What you want from them is to deliver something that performs the requirements you gave them. Okay? That's a simple way of looking at it. And finally, involve suppliers in the understanding of the need if that would add value. That's the first step. Okay? Understanding the needs. Because you're not going to procure anything. Okay? I mean, you could, but it won't be effective if you just buy things without understanding the need you had that led you to the purchase of the thing. So you start by understanding your problem before you go to the market. Now the next thing is review the market. So that means you have to check on the possibility that whatever you want is actually in the market, because it's not even guaranteed that everything you want is going to be in the market. Sometimes it means you have to go further than you actually think. Okay? And as far as understanding the market, Porter's 5 forces is a good way of looking at the market. And that means looking at the market in terms of the buyer power, the supplier power. Like when is the buyer strong, when is the supplier strong? Of course, it depends on who are the majority in that market. In terms of entrance, new entrance in that market, in terms of substitute available, okay? And in terms of the competitive rivalry in that market. All these are 5 forces that are, presented by the Porter's, the Porter's 5 forces, okay? Which help you to analyze the market. So you review the market, okay? And then develop a strategy. So by taking a more strategic approach, procurement can add value by leveraging expertise and knowledge in the following ways. Number 1, spend reviews across various areas, provide a fuller overview than reviewing spend on contract by contract basis. Number 2, following on from reviews, procurement can aggregate demand and consolidate spend, which can result in reduced cost. Number 3, supplier relationship management and improved risk management plans can be developed. Number 4, specialist category and supplier knowledge regarding the market and potential sources of supply can be developed. And then we move to contract management. So when it comes to value creation, this one will go hand in hand with how the sort of relationship you have with your suppliers. Okay? You need to have a good relationship with your suppliers. Developing a relationship with suppliers is a key part in contract management. But then the question can be, how does developing a relationship with supplier result into value addition? And there are a number of ways, okay? For instance, be able to identify and use an appropriate approach to deal with supplier issues. Innovation development as part of collaborative project with strategic suppliers. Reduction of waste, okay? Resilience and risk reduction. Now, when we talk about waste, okay, what do you mean by reduction of waste? And there are 7 types of waste according to Taichi Ono, which you need to control. And these wastes are excessive transportation, unnecessary motion, waiting, overproduction, overprocessing, as well as defects. And if you have a good relationship with your suppliers, that would actually mean that you can do something like just-in-time production or even lean production, okay? Which means you don't have to hold a lot of, you don't have to hold a lot of stock. You just get whatever you want if and when you get it. And that will really depend on how fast the supplier is at supplying. And that is something you can know if you have a good relationship with them. And that will help you to reduce waste, as stock holding is one of the wastes, okay? Or even the time you spend on transporting things either to the factory or even within the factory itself. That can also be waste, plus all those other things, okay? So let's move on. Identifying, assessment, and selection of suppliers to secure successful relationships. So now that you're aware of whatever it is that you want, you've looked at the market, you've even come up with the way that you're going to manage that contract, then we need to look to identify the suppliers that you're going to deal with, okay? Remember, this is just part of the entire procurement cycle that we're looking at. We are only looking at it in terms of value addition and then you are also prioritizing supplier relationship. That is why it might look different from, say, just general procurement cycle, right? But the concept is the same. So in this case, let's start by talking about supplier identification in private sector. Now, supplier identification involves buyer looking at its external environment. After a buyer has developed a requirement, reviewed the market structure, and developed a strategy, the process of supplier identification begins. Where do you get suppliers? In fact, there are various places that you can get suppliers in private sector. So in this case, you're talking about internal stakeholders, okay? That is use of department knowledge. Preferred supplier list. In this case, you have a list of suppliers that you've been working with, either that will form part of, say, a framework arrangement or a framework agreement. So you just have a list of suppliers that you prefer to work with, and then you just do, calls, okay? You can also go with internet searches, using agents, advertisements on procurement platforms, etc. So once you have this list of suppliers, okay, there are still questions that you need to ask yourself. You just don't say you are the one who's going to work with us. No, there are things you still need to ask yourself. And these will include things like how many suppliers in the marketplace are able to provide the product or service? Is it a one-off sourcing or not? What is the relative buyer and supplier power in the marketplace? How might suppliers in the marketplace view the buyer? Do all suppliers have the same view? How will the makeup of the market affect the selection process? And so based on all that, okay, you get to know which suppliers are actually going to be, shortlisted, and which ones you're not even going to look at, okay? So let's move on. That is as far as suppliers in the private sector is concerned, as far as identifying them. So let's talk about doing the same, but in public sectors. Supplier identification in public sector. In public sector, things tend to be, again, as you pointed out, things tend to be very, very transparent. And the reason why that is required is because in this case, we are dealing with taxpayers' money. You're not dealing with our money, right? And that's the reason why, things like corruption and all that are a big deal there. So in this situation, the rules will depend on which country you are in. When undertaking procurement in public sector in the European Union, the buyer will be required to advertise the requirement in the official journal of the European Union. That is the OJEU. And what will that do? That will ensure that once you put the advert on that platform, all the members of the European Union, basically all the country members in the European Union, will be able to see that advertisement, which means if they want to supply something, well, they can do that. So you see, that's one way of creating transparency, which is not really something you see in private sector. You don't say like if a company wants to advertise, they must do it here so that it's not a big deal there. And let's talk about now supplier assessment stage, pre-qualification and selection. Now, once you've identified your supplier, then you need to move on to the selection stage, okay? You need to move on to assessment and selection process, which will involve developing requests for information, that is the RFI documents and criteria, evaluating suppliers against these criteria, that is only suppliers that meet the buyer's minimum requirement will be shortlisted and will progress to the next stage, okay? And these one usually involve the use of request for proposal. Okay, look. A request for proposal is just the company's way of saying that we have a problem, okay? And we need you to propose how you're going to solve that particular problem. So give us a proposal, okay? So here's a problem. We need 1, 2, 3. We need a website. We need whatever it is. We need a fleet of cars, or, logistic problems, whatever it is, okay? So write us a proposal, okay, based on these criteria or these issues that we need to be handled. And then we are going to select the best proposal and award a contract. So this one will depend. First of all, there's going to be request for information, the RFI, okay? And then from there, we move on to this stage. And the next thing is evaluate tenders. Again, the practical aspects of all these will vary, okay? They will vary from public sector to, they won't be the same. They'll be different in public sector as opposed to, say, private sector. So let's look at those two and see what is what. And let's start with supplier assessment stage, pre-qualification and selection in private sector. So in private sector, again, most things just come down to the policy of the company, that particular company. For example, a buyer may be required to obtain at least 3 quotes or tenders for all contract worth over $10,000. Of course, the buyer will still need to follow other criteria, which will depend, on the sort of risks associated with this particular procurement. So they'll still need to look at risk, assessment. They'll still need to look at all that stuff, not just this is how much the tender is worth, and therefore we need, there's more to it than that. Even something like competitive bidding can also be used, since it's all about achieving value for money. But the trick is knowing when to use it, competitive bidding, and when not to use it. So when is it advisable to use competitive bidding? Number 1, when the item or service is of sufficient value, when there is a clear specification so that competitive bids can be evaluated side by side, when competition exists between a number of good quality suppliers, when there is enough time for the process to be completed properly. And when is it not a good idea to go with that? Because if you know when you're going to use it, it means the opposite also is true. You know when you're not going to use it. So in this case, when it is not possible to obtain firm prices, when the specification is likely to change, when price is not the main driver, when setup cost and time is prohibitive. Remember, this is when you start doing things like negotiation and all that stuff. Anyway, so to sum up these, in our private sectors, we start with RFIs. We start with requests for information. So whatever it is that you want, we're going to request that, and the potential suppliers are going to send this. And then based on the information we get, we may choose the ones, the suppliers that seem to be at least able to help us get where we want, and then move on to request for proposal. So we'll request for proposal from those selected suppliers, and then that means we're going to evaluate the proposals, and anyway, we'll move on to the award criteria. But the thing is, what information can be requested at the RFI stage? And in this case, we're talking about information on previous contracts that are relevant to the buyer's requirement. Financial information like income statement, balance sheet. Insurance, so this could include public, employers, and product liability. Certificates such as ISO accreditations. Supplier acceptance of buyer standard payment terms and contractual terms and conditions. Number 6, minimum levels of health and safety standards. And so you'll go over those ones and then decide who you're going to be working with. You're going to shortlist, not working with. At this point, you're just shortlisting them because they're still the next stage. Now, here's something that you need to find an answer to, learning by doing. What are the benefits and drawbacks of using competitive tender process? So what is that? Let's talk about supplier assessment stage, pre-qualification, and selection in public sector. And again, the principles are still the same. You need transparency here. That's the thing. That's the thing you always have to understand or to remember when talking about public procurement. It's always just going to come down to how transparent the procedure is, or what are the requirements as far as transparency is concerned. And this will mean things like transparency in the procurement process, equality of treatment of suppliers, non-discrimination, which will determine how fair or how far your advertisement should reach. Proportionality, that is, the procurement process must be proportionate to the value of the contract. In public sectors, procurement usually take 2 main stages. In this case, we're talking about, it involves the initial pre-qualification questionnaire, that is PPQ, to create a short list of suppliers, and then the shortlisted suppliers based on those questionnaires. So whatever information will be required by those questionnaires, the ones who seem to have, qualified at that stage will move on to the next stage. So in this case, invitation to tender. So that's the thing there. We pre-qualify our suppliers, and then based on that, we get a short, and we are pre-qualifying them using the questionnaires, right? And then you create a short list of these suppliers, and then now it's invitation to tender. Right. And the next stage is award stage. So selection and awarding. Meaning what? Meaning it's now time to decide on who the suppliers are actually going to be. What we've been doing is identifying suppliers, shortlisting them, and then evaluating. And now you need to select who exactly are we going to award a contract to. And so let's start with the private sector, okay? Not public. So selection and award criteria in private sector. And again, look, as we pointed out earlier, in this case, we're just using request for proposal. Of course, you can still go with tenders, okay, in private sectors. So it's not like if I've said, if you're using request for proposal, now ignoring the invitation to tender, you can still go with that. You can still do the expression of interest, and then you look at whatever they've provided, and then you move on with the tendering process, evaluating the bids, and then awarding. So that can still happen, okay? You can still use the normal tender procedures. But in this case, you're just simplifying it. We're assuming you requested for information, the information came in, and then you requested for proposal, and now they've submitted their proposals, and then you decide on which one makes sense, and then you award, right? Because alternatively, you can just do the expression of interest, those ones who are interested based on the criteria that you set up, evaluate those bids, and then, same thing, right? Generally, the buyer will need to know the following. Number one, detailed information on how the supplier will produce the product or deliver the service, okay, including method statements, risk assessment, and then full pricing information. And again, these sort of just comes down to the policy that you have in your organization, okay? So your policy regarding risk, your policy regarding prices, your policy, things like credit score, maybe. Those are some of the things that you might use to assess who you're going to be working with at this stage. And selection and awarding criteria in public sector, that is the next thing. Now, with public sector, after the pre-qualification questionnaires, okay, and now we have a short list of candidates, or in this case, suppliers you're going to deal with. Then the next thing you're going to be worrying about is, in this case, we can go with open tender process, okay? We can go with restricted tender process. We can go with competitive procedure with negotiation. We can go with competitive dialogue, or even innovative partnership procedures. And all those are just ways of deciding on who we are going to be working with. I mean, with open tenders, it's just like anybody can apply. Restricted, well, it isn't anybody. It's probably just some people in the short list who are allowed to apply. Or we say we can restrict it to a certain channel. Maybe you just apply using this particular platform. The point is, all those are criteria that could be used in public sector. Now, as you're going along, remember, if you have any question, you ask, so you don't just sit there with your question, right? Right, so let's move on to the next thing. Now, let us compare team management techniques to ensure positive stakeholder relationships. And at this point, we've already pointed out that stakeholders are people who can affect or be affected by whatever it is that we are doing as an organization. Okay? Or in this case, they can affect how the procurement thing goes along. There are a number of techniques that procurement teams can use to ensure positive stakeholder relationships. So let's start with positive relationships through positive contribution. And one of the best ways to build positive relationship with business stakeholders is to ensure that they feel their interests have been considered and that they are kept informed regarding initial objectives and project plans, progress, outcomes, etc. And you're not going to do any of that, okay? You're not going to be like keeping people informed if you don't even know who these people are. So the first thing that you need to start with is identifying who these stakeholders are. And that calls for stakeholder mapping. So what is stakeholder mapping? This is the process of identifying, diagramming, prioritizing stakeholders by analyzing their influence and interest in a project, or whatever it is that you're doing. In this case, it could be the procurement activities. And the benefits of doing these will include, it allows identification of key stakeholders, that is key players, who will need to be closely involved in the process. Number two, it allows identification of key stakeholders that need a higher level of communication due to their level of power and interest. Number next, it allows us to start thinking of how each stakeholder should be prioritized and managed in the right way. And finally, when positive relationships are created and actively managed, the outcomes of a project or procurement are likely to be better. This is because the stakeholder's perspective will provide the buyer with useful information and insights. Now, one of the easiest model, one of the best models that you can use to do this is the Mandelo matrix, okay? So in this case, we have horizontal and vertical axis. So the horizontal axis looks at stakeholders' level of interest, or how interested is the stakeholder in the requirement, the procurement process, and the outcome. So there is the level of interest, and then there is the amount of power that they also have, okay? And that's another one. So the vertical axis looks at the power a stakeholder has to influence. So remember, power is the ability to influence. So there is how much of that they have, and then there is actually the level of interest they have. So they could be powerful, but are not really interested in what you're doing. Or they could be very interested, but not powerful. So anyway, with all that, you end up with these. So you have, in fact, let's look at this practically. So imagine a company that is procuring new IT software. In this case, let's assume this company is trying to buy a CRM, okay? A CRM or stock management software, whatever it is, it doesn't matter, right? They're buying that, okay? So in this case, what exactly are they going to be dealing with? Now, the first stage they need to look at is who are the stakeholders. So identifying stakeholders, and in this case, the stakeholders could involve company executives, finance department, okay, employees, suppliers, regulatory bodies, etc. Now that you have understood these, okay, remember we are trying to do the Mendel's matrix in a practical manner, right? So now that you've identified who these stakeholders are, the next thing is we have to look at them in terms of their power, okay, and their interest in this particular software that you're interested in buying. Okay, so power, interest. And then you end up with stakeholders will fall under the following 4 quadrants. So number 1, some stakeholders should be managed with minimal effort. So they are stakeholders. These are stakeholders who are low in power and their level of interest is also low. And what that means is that it won't take much to meet their needs, but you still need to meet those needs. From our IT example, regulatory bodies will fall in these categories. They have little day-to-day involvement, but need to be assured that the procurement complies with regulation. And then the next quadrant, there are some stakeholders to keep informed. So these are stakeholders who have interest, but they lack power. Okay? Interest is there, power is less. Example here will be the end users of the softwares. They will be using the new software daily and are very interested in its functionality and usability. Now, this group may try to gain power by joining with stakeholders who are either key players or they are to keep satisfied. They will need to be kept informed regularly of plans, outcomes, and changes. Okay, so this means things like training them, okay, letting them know the updates that are going to come in relation to that software. And then the next quadrant, there are some stakeholders to keep satisfied. And these are interesting stakeholders because they have high power. The interest is low, but they have a lot of power. And so you really don't want them to get that interested in whatever it is that you're doing. And so you just want them to be happy the way they are. Okay, you have to keep them satisfied. So example here could be the finance department. They control the budget, but may not be deeply interested in the technical aspect of the software. And how do you keep them satisfied? That could be the question. And the answer here could be doing things like periodic financial updates, ensuring budget compliance, addressing any financial concerns promptly. And then finally, you have the key players. Okay, some stakeholders are key players. These ones, they have a lot of everything. They have power and they have a higher degree of interest. So this group will need to be involved early in the process and should participate in key decision making in order to secure their support. For example, okay, so in our case here, in the case of the IT here, you're going to be having people like the management, okay, so the top management. They have the authority to approve the budget and make final decisions. They are highly interested in the project success as it impacts the overall strategic goal. And so with these sort of stakeholders, what do you need to do? So with these ones, you need to ensure that regular updates, involvement in major decisions, and high-level progress reports are given to them. Now, you look at that and then you say, that is a very useful model. But the truth is, as useful as that model seems, okay, it still has some setbacks, okay? It has some issues. So like in example, the model does not consider whether the stakeholders are supporters of the project or against it. when mapping the stakeholders, their level of interest may be underestimated, which is a very subjective concept. This could result in under-engaged stakeholders, slowing down the process of approval, and then the concept of power may be misunderstood. Also, the mapping exercise may result in the selection of strategies that are biased to one type of stakeholder group. Now let's move on. Let's talk about resolving stakeholder differences. So after mapping out your stakeholders, okay, you will still realize that there are some who are just going to resist whatever it is that you're coming up with. And there are many reasons why people resist projects, okay? The point is, there are those who are just going to be resistant, and you need to take care of those ones as well, okay? Here's a model to help you with that. In this case, you're looking at stakeholders in terms of their influence or power against their stance on the project. And you end up with silent opponents, okay? They are low in power, but oppose what you are doing. And so what you want to do with these ones is you want to monitor them so they don't become more powerful, okay? Because you already know that they're opposing what you're doing. And then you have supporters, okay? So these guys are low in power or ability to influence, but they support you, and you have to keep them satisfied because, okay, you need their support. And then you have negative leaders. So they have a lot of power, but do not support the project. With these, you have to convince them on the benefits that they get from the project. And then you have promoters, okay? They have power and also support the project. What you need to be doing with this kind of information is you look at that quadrant, and then you move people from the left and take them to the right, okay? In short, the negative leaders and the silent opponents, and turn them into promoters and supporters. Now, remember, it doesn't have to be in procurement. Things don't have to be as dramatic as you're putting it. Sometimes the opposition could be as simple as some stakeholders they just don't want you to switch suppliers. You know, we are used to this supplier and now you want a new supplier. And they're like, no, we are good with these ones for reasons best known to them. So sometimes that is just what it comes down to. And your argument that these will reduce cost and improve quality may not be good enough for them. Now, why do they do that? Okay, so there are a number of reasons why people will resist, okay? And this could include things like fear of change or uncertainty, okay? As well as loss of control. So sometimes they just think that we are losing our grip on this thing. And so if you accept that change, then those people are in charge and we are no longer in charge. Sometimes that's just the reason why people resist. So, okay, let's move on. Remember again, questions, ask, don't sit there with your question. Let's look at the stages of team development. And there are many reasons why you're going to use team in procurement, okay? And these reasons will include, they help with more comprehensive and accurate specification, resulting in reduced cost. There is improved risk management by viewing risk in a more holistic, organization-wide basis. There is knowledge sharing, okay, which will lead to development of team members. Now, according to Tuckman's team and group development model, there are 4 stages to team development. And in this case, we're talking about the forming, storming, norming, performing. Now let's start with forming. So this is where the team comes together. I mean, they don't know who is who. Basically, they've just met, and usually they are clueless about each other, okay? Therefore, the forming stage is a staggered process. The idea is that they're starting to learn about each other, and they may not even like each other. I mean, that's the thing when people are coming, together for the first time. Since the stage is characterized by uncertainty, team building activities are a good idea here. And then we have storming. So at this point, the members start to challenge each other because, who's going to be in charge of this group? We don't even like that guy's character. And why is that guy dressed that way? The point is, there's a lot of challenge that goes on in this stage. In fact, some groups don't even make it past this stage, okay? As a result, team performance may decline at this stage of team development. So the team manager will need to now support the team because, again, as we pointed out, some teams don't make it past this period. And so this is where things like having clear goals, okay? Clear goals for the team will help. So for example, to generate saving of 10% or reduce supplier base. And by having that goal to help them, focus, so they know that as we solve this problem, they get to be comfortable with each other. And that's a good thing at this stage. Now, the next stage is norming. At this third stage, the team performance begins to improve since members are now starting to work effectively. Now, members have an idea of the rules that govern the team. That's the point here, okay? Now we know who's who, we know what is what. And then we move to performance. At this stage, the team is performing at a high level. Of course, the thing you have to understand is that also, if teams can end up just failing at the norming stage or even at the storming stage, so it's not like if they all make it here, but those who make it here work effectively. So what are some of the reasons, or what are some of the characteristics of teams that don't perform effectively, or teams that don't end up working together better? So they'll be characterized by a number of things like poor communication between the members, okay? Lack of clarity on job roles and responsibility, blaming other members of the team for failure, lack of focus on achieving objectives, not meeting deadlines is another problem that they will be having. Let's compare the practical considerations of stakeholders management. At this point, what are we aware of? At this point, you're aware of how to, map out your stakeholders. Even look at them in terms of power, interest, and all that stuff. Now, let's talk about how they contribute towards success of whatever it is that you're doing, like procurement in this case. How do they come in and help, okay? And let's start with accurate cost modeling. And before you jump into the accurate cost modeling, you need to be in a position to understand that there is a difference between cost and price. What exactly is the difference? Apart from the spellings, right? Cost is the total sum involved, including all procedures associated with ownership and use of product or service, including the price. While price is just the amount that you pay the supplier, okay? So what you're simply saying is that cost is more than the price. If you buy a car, you pay a price, but then there are other amounts associated with owning that car. And so what exactly is cost modeling or accurate cost modeling? Cost modeling is a process that buyers use to understand all the costs that make up a supplier's price. So the idea is to understand how the cost is broken down, okay? And then you can use that information either to negotiate, or you can know where to save or where to cut back on. Cost modeling can be used to identify overpriced elements and elements of the product or service that have a higher profit margin. And to understand these, okay, let's look at it from a practical angle. That way we don't just say abstract stuff and you nod your head and you'll be like, I understand, and then, like practical aspects, zero. So let's look at it practically, okay? Let's assume that you have a company that manufactures home appliance. And in this case, they decide to undertake accurate cost modeling in procurement to optimize their sourcing strategy for a new line of energy efficient refrigerators. And the first step when they're doing this, when they are doing the cost, modeling, they need to ask themselves, what are our objectives in this case? What are our objectives here? What do we intend to achieve? And let's assume that the objective is to reduce procurement costs while maintaining or improving product quality and ensuring sustainability. And so now that they have the objectives, the next stage is to identify their specifications. What do they want? And they outline the specification for the new refrigerator, including materials, so in this case stainless steel, recyclable plastics, energy efficient components, okay, performance standards, and sustainability certifications. And so after that, after coming up with the specification, now they move on to the next component, which is the cost component. And they classify, that means classifying their costs in terms of direct costs, okay, and indirect costs. Direct costs associated with whatever it is that they're producing. Remember that, okay? So if you're making a fridge, all the costs associated with producing that fridge, direct cost. Every other cost that can't directly be attributed to the product you're producing, but is part of the process, like the people buy biros and then they're using those biros, which can't be attributed to that fridge, but you wrote somewhere, this is what we need to do. See, those ones become indirect costs. So anyway, they do that. And then they collect data from the market as well as analyze suppliers' offers. And so with that information, with all those information, they can now go ahead and develop their cost model. Okay, things like creating a detailed cost model for different sourcing scenarios. For example, sourcing stainless steel from a local supplier versus international supplier, considering tariffs, shipping costs, and lead times. And then after that, they're going to select the suppliers. The point here is that they're making all these models. Like if we do this is how much it's going to cost us. If we go local, this is how much it will cost us. If we deal with international suppliers, this is how much it's going to cost us. So they're not just buying stuff. They're running all these models and deciding on which one makes more sense and which one we are going to use. And then they select suppliers depending on whatever it is that they've come up with. What are the benefits of accurate cost modeling? It will allow the buyers to know what makes up the supplier's cost, which is useful information when negotiating. Number two, it can be used as a baseline to calculate how much saving can be achieved. And so the thing is, as you go about with your cost modeling, okay, you want it to be accurate, then there are a number of things that you need to pay attention to. And in this case, we're talking about things like capture cost drivers and not just cost elements, okay? I mean, take something like labor. Now you might say, if we do this thing locally, it's going to cost us more or less, whatever, okay? So let's say it's going to cost us more. But if we do it overseas or if we do it in some other country, it's going to cost us less. You see, that's just an element of that cost, labor, right? But then what about things like wages, minimum wage? What about the rules and regulations that could come up in that country? These are things that you also have to factor in because they are things that will drive that cost, which you may not really see now, but you need to factor them in. Number two, consider the impact of total cost of ownership. Number three, keep it simple. And number four, always use data to support your assumptions. And with that, let's move on to reduce the next thing. So the next thing is reduced impact of price fluctuation. Price fluctuation can have a huge impact on your profitability. And we're just saying that stakeholders can, at this point, we are looking at how stakeholders can help you, right? So just saying by understanding or dealing or rather collaborating with the relevant stakeholders in your procurement process, they can help you to deal with things like price fluctuations. Commodity products such as oil, grain, precious metals are more at risk, okay? Most at risk of price increases. And there are a number of reasons why price can behave these, okay? There are a number of reasons why price tend to fluctuate. And these will include things like a product becomes scarce and demand outstrips supply, increase in import duties and exchange rates, political instability. And again, as I pointed out, we're just trying to figure out how stakeholders can help us in this case, like in the case of price fluctuation, okay? So how do they help? And in order for you to get most from your stakeholders, okay, then you'll need to work together by doing things like monitoring elements in the market across the whole value network of suppliers that could increase cost, buying in bulk to avoid later price increase, working with suppliers to remove waste in the supply chain, preparing strategies to deal with increase. For instance, if import duties are going to increase, then this could mean sourcing within one own country if that is possible. Now, the next thing to talk about is early supplier involvement in product and service development. Early supply involvement, that is ESI, is a type of collaboration between a buyer and a supplier in which the buying organization involves the supplier in the product or service development process. Obviously, you're not going to do this with just all your suppliers. You only do these with suppliers that are strategic, the ones that you really want to collaborate with. That's the whole point here. So it isn't like if you're a supplier, this is what you want to do, what's your take on this? Because it's going to be time consuming and it's also going to be expensive. So you just can't do that with everyone. The process is to create a superior end product or service with a greater value than the buying organization could have created alone. Now, the degree of involvement, okay? When it comes to involving your suppliers in anything, that degree of involvement will range from not involving them to really, really, really involving them. Meaning what? Meaning you can have, number one, none, where there is no supply involvement, okay? So you just tell the suppliers this is what you want, and then that's it. It's like a t-shirt. Okay, get me a t-shirt and have it printed. There is nothing. Here's the design, here's the color, print. So no involvement, they just print and then deliver. Number two, white box. So in this case, the buyer informally consults, okay, with the supplier on things like buyer's design. And then we have gray box. So in this case, there is formalized supply integration, basically joint development between the buyer and the supplier. And then you have the black box. In this case, the design is primarily supplier driven based on buyer's specification. So it ranges from The buyer being the one totally in control, to the part where the supplier is the one who's actually doing everything. You just tell them what they want. That's the degree of involvement. Now, there are a number of benefits associated with involving suppliers, and this could include the supplier may be able to bring additional knowledge and innovation to the product, to the product design stage or process, which could result in cost saving. Number two, the overall quality of the product can be improved. Of course, the product cost can be reduced and it can increase the speed of getting product manufactured. But then, just because you say that involving suppliers is a good idea doesn't mean that there isn't a downside. There is also a downside, So in this case, there are often communication issues between the parties that can be challenging. And then, of course, the amount of time involved is a lot. And now let's talk about identifying the process of terminating stakeholder relationship. So far, we've been talking about, how you can make the stakeholder, the relationship work, with your suppliers and all that. But the truth is, there are moments when this thing is not going to be working. And so you have to end it. But then you just don't end it because there is a problem, with just terminating relationships, There is cost associated with that. There are legal implications. There are all these things. So how do you go about doing that? And these are some of the things that you're going to look at in this stage. And let's start with reasons for terminating. Now, the buyer-supplier relationship may come to an end because of various reasons. For example, the contract comes to a natural end and you have no reasons to purchase that product or service. The contract has reached the end date specified in terms and conditions. The contract has been retendered to another supplier who provides a more competitive offer. The supplier suddenly increases price with no justifiable reason. The contract is terminated due to a material breach. The supplier is involved in activities that could damage the reputation of the buyer by association, or the supplier becomes insolvent. And if you look at that and then you think, well, all these things are buyer related. The assumption here is, the truth is most of the time buyers are the ones who tend to terminate these relationships. But of course, supplier can also drop a buyer, If the supplier realizes that these are nuisance customer, we don't need them, they're not good for our portfolio. And usually as a buyer, when you realize that, you want to make sure that you put yourself in a position where the supplier finds you attractive. Other than that, the supplier can also just end up ending that contract. It's only that we are looking at it from a buyer's perspective, So let's talk about the process of terminating the relationship. And we know that you just don't enter a contract with an aim of terminating it. But as we've seen, based on all those reasons, there are things that can happen. And those things will call for terminating that relationship. So there are likely to be both financial and operational risks associated with terminating a contract. For example, the buyer not being able to deliver to its own customer and as a result, not being paid. But when it comes to termination, so the process can be summed up in the following manner. So we have supplier, so supplier has performance issues. During contract management, the supplier still fails to improve performance. So as a buyer, you obtain business approvals to terminate, you develop exit strategy, review the market and qualify new suppliers, give a written notice of termination and manage the exit strategy. That's cyclic, Now let's go over that so that you can see what are some of the things that will be involved, in the process. And let's start with identifying performance issue and contract management. So the first step in that model, obviously, is to identify what is the problem. And this is something that you'll notice when you're doing contract management. And that is the reason why you always manage contract. You don't wait for things to go bad. And that is when you start saying, they're not delivering. You should have noticed that, So when you're doing that, you identify that, this supplier has an issue. Termination will generally be the last resort, When you identify an issue, you just don't say, let's end this, You still try to see if you can make it work. Like you tell the supplier, look, you are supposed to deliver this, you haven't, what's the issue? If it is something that can be fixed, you fix it. Because look, not all suppliers are created equal. Some of them are going to be strategic, These are suppliers you really rely on and you just don't want to end the contract, So you try and fix it. But if they can't fix it, then obviously you move to the next stage. The next stage is obtaining business approval to terminate, depending on who's doing the termination, okay? If it is a supplier who's trying to terminate you, then you've already pointed out, okay? To solve that problem, you want to make yourself attractive to the supplier. Is it a payment issue? Is it that you complain a lot? Is it that you keep on changing a specification? But let's assume it's the buyer who now wants to terminate the supplier. So you just won't terminate the supplier. Remember, we've already, pointed out that you're dealing with stakeholders. They are people, you have bosses, okay? And all these people that are involved, are they okay with you doing that? If the buyer is the one doing the termination, depending on the value of the contract, the type of relationship, and whether or not the supplier is considered strategic, the buyer will have to develop and present a business case to relevant stakeholders showing why the supplier has to go. So in this case, that could mean doing a business case and presenting it to your executive management. And if they approve that, then you move on to the next stage, which in this case is developing exit strategy. Remember, when the supplier is leaving, you need a new supplier. So you just can't be like, go, and then you start worrying about the new supplier, because you'll be in a position where you don't have a supplier, which means you're not meeting your buyer's needs, okay? And things to consider here will involve things like what will happen to any stock currently on supplier's premise, what will happen to any asset or equipment that belongs to the supplier or have joint ownership, what about any outstanding work the supplier is required to complete, what about outstanding payment to the supplier. So all these are things that you need to worry about when you're developing your exit strategy. So don't be just emotional and be like, you're fired. We no longer want to work with you because you are, whatever, control the emotions, okay? Now, the next thing is review the market and qualify new suppliers. So the thing is that before you even let go of that old supplier, you should be in a position, or rather you should have a guarantee that you have a new supplier coming in. Otherwise, you're just going to be in problems, okay? You're going to be in a situation where the one supplier is gone and you're wasting time trying to find a new one. So that's the thing you have to do here, okay? So the process will be easier if there are several alternative suppliers in the marketplace. And then the next stage is give written notice of termination. Now, most of the time, contracts will specify how they are supposed to be terminated and the communication requirement, okay? So communication is important, okay? Communicating the termination is an important step in the process. Now, in the absence of a formal written contract, English law states that a reasonable period notice should be given. And then the next stage is manage exit and new supplier onboarding. And this is where you get a new supplier, contract with them, and things continue. A contract will have to be developed, signed, and realistically, there's likely to be a crossover period involving both exiting and new supplier. So again, that's just the cyclic nature of that process. If there is any question, as always, you ask. Now let's talk about the legal considerations, okay, to factor in. Look, just because you've ended that relationship with the supplier doesn't mean that things are just going to be okay. There are going to be factors, okay? There are going to be issues that you'll have to factor in before you even terminate a relationship with your supplier, okay? And in this case, you're talking about things like finances, okay? Things like employees, etc. So to ensure that things run on smoothly, you always want to ensure that all contracts you get into have a clearly stated termination provision, okay? And it is for these reasons that most organizations will avoid entering into evergreen contracts or contracts with auto-renewal clauses. At times a buyer can have a contract, okay? In their contract, they can have a termination for convenience clause, which means that particular buyer can just terminate that contract for any reason. A well put together contract should also have detailed provision covering the responsibilities of both the buyer and supplier on termination in relation to finance, confidentiality, intellectual property rights, security, and employee rights, among other things. So let's go over some of the things that some of those, okay, and see how they can affect you or how you can be affected by them when terminating contracts. And let's start with finances, okay? So before you rush into ending a contract prematurely or early, you always need to figure out what will be the cost of you doing that? What are the costs associated with you terminating that contract? Because there is always going to be a cost. Remember, there are more likely to be financial penalties for early termination if the contract is governed by the terms and conditions of the supplier. And even if we ignore what the contract says, okay, like even if we ignore the clauses, let's just hold them constant. There are still other costs associated with terminating a contract early. For example, there is a cost associated with getting a new supplier. And then during that stage where the supplier is still trying to, get things running, what about supply? Do you have a guarantee that supply will continue? So there is that. So the point here is you need to worry about the finances associated with terminating a contract. Number 2, confidentiality. Okay. So when you terminate a relationship with a supplier, you still have to worry about whether or not they can disclose some confidential material, okay, or some confidential information that the two of you were aware of in that particular contract. And this information could include details of a buyer's production process or technical product. If any of this information is released into the marketplace, it could seriously affect a buyer's competitive advantage and therefore its future profitability. So that is the reason why you always want to ensure that you have confidentiality provisions, okay, in your contract. Things like non-disclose agreement become a big part of contracts. So this will often include indemnity agreement, so that if a party breaches these terms, there will be financial penalties. So you want to ensure that that is in place, okay? If you just go running your mouth after this, then you're really going to pay a huge amount of money. So those are, because when you end relationship with suppliers, it's not always the case that the contract came to a natural end. Sometimes they are bitter, okay? And it's not just suppliers. I mean, we're just talking about any party that you're contracting with. So anyway, let's move on to the next one. Intellectual property rights. And these will include things like patent, copyright, trade secrets, and trademarks. And generally, how you go about dealing with these will just depend on who owns those particular rights. So that is something else that you also need to factor in before we end this contract. How do we deal with intellectual property rights? Especially if there is joint sort of, IPRs, okay? Like there's something you and, like arising IPs, okay? So something you and your supplier are working on together. So how do you deal with that when that relationship is over? Again, these are things that have to be charted out before or during the process of ending that, relationship that you have with that particular supplier. And now let's talk about succession issues and continuity of supply. Now, the one thing that you should be paying attention through all this, everything that we've been talking about, is that when that relationship with the supplier is over, okay, you still need for the supply to continue. Because that is the main thing. Once we interfere with the flow of supply, then it's not just the supply, there is whatever it is that we are doing, okay? Remember, inputs, production, output. So if the input is interrupted, then what do you think is going to happen to the output, okay? So we need to have that supply flow guaranteed. And, some of the things that you need to factor in your exit strategy will include an obligation for the current supplier to continue delivering services at the level of quality for the transition period, an obligation for the supplier to continue to abide by all terms and conditions for the contract, as well as a requirement for the supplier to provide access to the buyer to all the necessary information that will be required to keep delivering the services after the transition period. The point here is you want the supply to continue to flow. So anyway, if there is any question, do let me know, okay? And yeah, I'll see you in the next video.